Good morning. My name is Sarah Compton, and I'm a junior researcher at the Department of Languages here at the University of Jyvaskyla, and I'm also part of the Peripheral Multilingualism project. And I'm delighted to be here with you all this morning to talk about invisible multimodal multilingualism and looking at the case of sign languages here in Finland. I would like to begin by inviting you to engage in a reflection activity with me. So I'd like for you to think about a time when you noticed a conversation between individuals and you thought to yourself, that's really interesting. They're using a language that I don't recognize or that I don't understand. So I want you to think about where you were and who you were with when that encounter happened, and kind of keep that experience in the back of your mind as we do a little bit of myth busting about sign languages together over the next couple of minutes. So there are perhaps three myths that are most common, or that I hear often when lots of people ask great questions about sign languages and multilingualism and so forth. And some of the things that I hear, or questions that I get oftentimes, the first is sign language a universal language? Right? Sign language is not a universal language, and it's one of the myths that we hope to bust today. Secondly, that sign languages are visual forms of spoken languages, that they're some kind of visual gestural representation of a spoken language. And then lastly, that most people who use sign languages are deaf. So we'll take each of these myths in turn. The first, then, being sign language is a universal language. And here you see two screenshots from a great ad by McDonald's, where they are trying to sell their products and say McDonald's is universally recognized, right? It's a universally spoken language, food language of some sort. And so they have this scene where they have individuals, sign language users, who are talking with each other in sign language. And then they have this tag that, sign language universally spoken, and McDonald's is universally spoken as well. So we see this myth being perpetuated through this type of advertising. The second myth is that sign languages are visual forms of spoken languages. And here I'll draw from Grostein's work, where he talks about bimodal bilingualism, wherein a deaf individual learns the sign language of the community, and then will oftentimes learn the written form, sometimes the spoken form of the spoken language of the community. And you'll also see that he refers to a signed form for spoken language. There are signed systems, for example, signed Finnish or signed English, that have been developed in the educational context to help deaf and hard of hearing students improve their language development in the spoken language. However, those are systems, much like Morse code or some other kind of system, but they're not natural languages that evolve. So it's important to make that distinction, to realize that sign languages are distinct and independent languages. And I would refer you to the Finnish Sign Language Center here at our university that is doing a lot of work as well to better understand the Finnish sign language and its structure and so on and so forth. Then the last myth is that most people who use sign languages are deaf. And if we think about the ways that we enter into language communities, it's usually through three different pathways, shall we say. The first being through the home or through birth, through a language community of some sort, through school and education, obviously through work and other domains as well, but these are perhaps the three primary pathways. So for deaf children of deaf adults and of hearing adults, deaf children of deaf adults will learn sign language in the home from birth, oftentimes if the deaf parents sign, and that's about 3 to 4% of deaf children, whereas the majority of deaf children are born into hearing families where sign language is most often not present, which is why the sign language communities and schools become very important contexts, both for the child, him or herself, as well as that child's family for learning sign language. If we think about then the hearing children of deaf adults, deaf couples, when they have children, 80% of they have an 80% probability of that child being hearing, actually, So most children of deaf parents who sign are actually hearing. So it really, oftentimes, as Mitchell and Karchmer point out, we often conflate deafness and sign language, right? When in fact, the majority of sign language users are actually hearing, as we'll see is the case here in Finland. So if we zoom in then on Finland and ask, so what are the sign languages that are used here in Finland? There are two primary languages that are used here. Finnish Sign Language, there are about 10 to 15,000 signers, 4,000 to 5,000 being deaf or hard of hearing, and 6,000 to 9,000 being hearing. And Finland's Swedish Sign Language, which we could consider to be a minority sign language, if you will. There are about 350 signers, with 150 being deaf or hard of hearing, and 200 individuals who are hearing. And it's also, I guess, important to point out that the Population Register Center of Finland allows and asks for each individual to register their language that they either speak or sign. And 48 persons, as of 2009, have registered sign language as their native language. And it's interesting that within the Finnish constitution and here as well in this language, we see that sign language is mentioned, but there's no mention of which sign language, right? So we can kind of think about the ideologies that are involved in and the reasons behind why just sign language is mentioned rather than naming a particular language. And then the question is, what about all the invisible sign languages here in Finland? What about Sami? Are there indigenous sign languages? Swedish, Russian, Somali, Afghan, American Sign Language. Are those languages present here in the country? And if so, how and where? So if we then return, we conclude how we began with this reflection activity. If you think about which language modality you were observing in that conversation that you were thinking about, was it a spoken language or was it a sign language? If it was a sign language, my question would be, were you thinking to yourself, they're using sign language? Or were you thinking to yourself, I wonder which sign language they're using? So I hope that the next time that you see, you walk by or run by or drive by a conversation where you see sign language users engaged in a very hearty conversation, that you'll think to yourself, I wonder which sign language they're signing or which sign languages they're drawing on to engage in that conversation. So with that, thank you so much for joining us this morning.